Hello, everybody. Glad you made the time from the lunch session for what is the most important commemorative event this year for the business and human rights community, what ought to be. Because as we know, 40 years ago, something happened in December. Put ourselves on the night of 2nd and 3rd December. There is a dark night. The temperature is cold. We are in the central Indian city called Bhopal. And there is a large pesticide plant. And people are fast asleep around it because in India, an industrial zone doesn't mean it's only an industrial zone. There are people who live nearby because they have jobs such as selling tea and mending people's footwear and all kinds of informal trades which come up around a large plant. It's a multinational plant, Union Carbide, and it makes pesticides for India. India has embarked on the green revolution. Pesticides are necessary to boost production. Production has been rising. India is becoming self-sufficient in food. All of those are good things, at least from the perspective of modern development perspective. But one of the tanks in which there is a chemical called methyl isocyanate explodes. And why it exploded and how it exploded remains a matter of query even today. The company thinks it was an internal sabotage. That's a theory they put out first. Later it was said it was only an accident. There were talks of negligence. There was talk of poor supervision. And there was also talk of supervisors not looking the other way when they should be looking at this way and changing things. Consequence, within the first few minutes, 2,000 people die. By the time it's morning, the toll rises to nearly 3. And over the next 20 years or 30 years, at least 20 or 25,000 people have had their lives significantly shortened. It's a large multinational which has been controlling the plant with 50.9% equity. It has largely Indian management, but the blueprints for the plant, how to manufacture it, what safety standards should be, have all come based on the template provided by the United States. The executive comes, the executive gets arrested, the executive is then allowed to leave the country. Cases are then going to get heard in the United States, they come back to India, a settlement is reached, and everything is supposed to have got sorted, but 40 years later, other crises have started, including polluted water seeping into the system, and people who were affected back in the 1980s still seeking justice. We can't have a better person than Indira Jaising speaking about this, former Additional Solicitor General of India, and she has been a lifelong fighter for human rights. I don't want to use words like crusader because with religious connotations, so I would call her a fighter, a champion for human rights. She has fought for people who don't have a voice, although they have the power, but their power is not being allowed to be exercised. She has fought for all sorts of issues, pavement dwellers in India, for civil liberties, against police atrocities, on gender equality and so on. But she was one of the first people in the Indian legal system to speak out, challenge, question, both from the perspective of corporate accountability, as well as from the perspective of access to antidotes and medicines. I've spoken enough, you come to hear her, so let me turn to her. Take us back to 1984, December. Where were you? What were your first thoughts? And how did you react?
Well, at the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this session together. It was, when I got this invitation and I accepted it, I asked a couple of my interns to work on this project. And the one thing that came out at that session with me and my interns was that they really didn't know much about this disaster.
And these are interns in India?
Yes, and then I realized that it was because they were born long after the disaster. We are meeting here 40 years after the disaster. So it's the act of memorializing it which I appreciate. And maybe I will say a few words about it later.
Absolutely.
Well, to answer your question, I was in Bombay, now known as Mumbai. But me and my colleagues, a lot of them, some lawyers, some non-lawyers, some who are today in this world, some are not in this world anymore, some who you might know, some who you might not know, were horrified. And some of them were chemists, some of them were biochemists, some of them were physicists, some of them were scientists, and some of us were lawyers. And it is this group of people that instantly knew what had happened. Instantly, I would say. It was like realizing something which is counterintuitive. It's intuitive. And the word MIC popped up, methyl isocyanate. And that links with the whole policy of India to have pesticides. It was a component of pesticides, and therefore it was peddled as a product that was essential to India's growth story, India's food security. And it was this substance which had, for want of a better word, escaped from the tanks in which it was stored. So it brings up so many issues. Why was it there in the first place? Why was it stored in such a large quantity? Why was it allowed to escape? What was the design of the plant? What were the safety measures? Was there no warning system in the country? And the plant was located in the center of human habitation. So, as somebody said, it was like it emerged in the form of a dark cloud at midnight, sweeping over the city and leaving only death and destruction in its trail. So I don't want to answer your question because till today, that memory haunts many of us who worked on it. I don't think the world has ever seen, it's been described as the world's largest industrial disaster till today. In fact, yesterday when I met you, I asked you this question, is there another comparable disaster? And your answer was no. It still continues to be the world's largest industrial disaster. So I'm very grateful to you for putting this together.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, immediately a lot of American lawyers who are called ambulance chasers had turned up, and the case was actually being heard in the New York District Court at that time. But it came to in India, and one reason it came to in India was that India argued that India was probably the better forum. Leading Indian lawyers made that case, that India is the right and appropriate forum because we have our witnesses are there, they know their familiarity with the system and so on. But in the process, as some people, including the lawyer and economist Shruti Rajagopalan has argued, it denied the agency of the victims and survivors to seek justice. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, was the decision to wrest the case back into India the right one?
I need to decorrect you and deconstruct what you've said. To begin with, it wasn't India who argued that the case should come back to India. It was Union Carbide, okay, who hired Mr. N.A. Palkiwala, who was India's foremost commercial lawyer, to say that India is the appropriate forum in which this case should be heard. So it was, the blame has to be laid squarely on the shoulders of Union Carbide Corporation for that issue. And the Union of India did not argue that the case should be transferred back to India. In fact, they made a large claim for damages. However, Judge Keenan did transfer the case back to India in what I consider to be an act of abdication of judicial duty. And the world has seen other examples where issues of this kind, which are for which a multinational corporation, a multinational enterprise is responsible. Union Carbide Corporation controlled the decision-making of its subsidiary in India. It made available the plant, as you said. It was responsible for the failure of safety measures. And so the case should have rightly been heard in the United States of America, but Judge Keenan took this decision that on the doctrine of forum non-convenience, it should be heard in India, and that's how it came to be transferred to India. Now on the question of agency, India passed what is known as the Bhopal Gas Leaks Disaster Act. Herein lies the problem. They took over the role of the plaintiff. And this was justified on the ground that there were more than 3 lakhs, how do you say it?
300,000.
300,000 victims. And you could not really expect 300,000 suits. India doesn't have a mass claim torts law. And so this law was designed for this specific disaster. So it was known as the Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Act. And under this act, they took over the complete responsibility for litigating the case. And that is what took away the agency of the victims. It eventually led to a settlement signed by the government of India in 1989, where they settled for a very small amount of money and they gave up the criminal case. So this is how the disaster occurred again.
Right,
It was
and
the
then,
second
and it has
disaster.
been a recurring nightmare. But if you were to look back at, let's look at the legal responsibility here. Should it rest with the Indian subsidiary, the parent corporation, bad local supervision, the state government of Madhya Pradesh, or the federal government of India at that time?
Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just read out from you from a 1983 document. Remember, this document comes well before the guiding principles that we are talking about today on United Nations Responsible Business and Human Rights. This is 82. I think these guiding principles came in
2011.
2011.
Yeah.
So here's a definition which might give you the answer to your question. The term transnational corporations, as used in this code, means an enterprise comprising entities in two or more countries, right? So you have United States and you have India, regardless of the legal form in which it is incorporated. So whether it's a subsidiary or whether it is a holding company, it doesn't matter. What matters is the capacity of decision-making in the parent company. And if that parent company has decision-making capacity over its subsidiary through a pattern of linked ownership, then it has to take responsibility for the what happens in its subsidiaries. This is not a universally accepted definition. It remains an incoherent document to this day, just as these principles remain guiding principles. But it is a concept that we used to say that it was Union Carbide that should have been held responsible. They provided the plant, they put in place the safety measures, they drafted the manuals, they had the standard operation procedures, and therefore I would say they were responsible. But it does not absolve the home state, that is India, from its responsibility, because the subsidiary was incorporated in India under Indian laws, and therefore the regulatory framework which ought to have been in place was an Indian regulatory framework, which was missing. And as you probably know, I've said very often, India's Environmental Act of 1986 is the gift of the victims of the Bhopal tragedy to the country, which very few people recognize. We did not have an Environment Protection Act when the disaster occurred on 3rd, 4th December 1984.
Now, I want to unpack two ideas here. One is the notion that you wrote about once, the whole idea of piercing the corporate veil, which was necessary in trying to understand the parent-subsidiary relationship here. And yet there's a whole notion of corporate impunity in this regard.
Yes, it's a very interesting. One of them I've elaborated. That is the relationship between UCC and Union Carbide India Limited. So it's the corporate form which allows entities to escape responsibility. And when we say pierce the corporate veil, what we mean is ignore the corporate form. Look at who has the controlling power. Now you can say the same thing with Dow Chemicals took over Union Carbide. What was it? It was just a sale of shares. That's all it is. That's all it takes to avoid responsibility. Sell your shareholdings and walk out. And the successor company says, well, you entered into a settlement, so we have no responsibility. So there again, you have to say, no, you are the successor company and you will be held responsible.
And I dare say one of the sad outcomes of Bhopal is that it has set a precedent in this regard, because we have cases such as Lundin, which has done something similar, of moving away from a troubled asset and selling assets elsewhere. It is also happening in the Niger Delta now, and it has happened in Colombian cases. So I dare say what it's become is that it's become a kind of a precedent-setting exercise for the other companies to evade exactly the sort of liability you're talking about. Now, you mentioned the Environmental Act, and that's why my next question is about that. Do we in India have adequate laws now to address such a scenario?
I believe we don't, because although the law came, it was too little too late. And there are rules under the law which are hazardous waste control rules, but there is a provision for impact assessment as well before any enterprise is undertaken. However, it's not an effective system. But of course, the one thing that Bhopal did contribute was activism. And we are meeting 40, I just happen to be surviving to tell you the tale today. But at the end of the day, let's not forget it's 40 years after the disaster occurred. And what for me is absolutely heartwarming is that those who started on this journey 40 years ago are even today on this journey, till today. They are inside the courtroom, they are fighting these cases, and they are the ones who are demanding that the provisions of the Environment Protection Act be implemented in letter and spirit.
And internationally, what kind of a framework would you want to see to prevent recurrence of exactly the parent company evading the liability of subsidy?
Well,
do we need a treaty? Do we need new laws? Do we need prosecutions?
Yes. For one, this definition of transnational corporations to be accepted. Number two, successor liability to be accepted regardless of bipartite settlements. And number three, of course, your business and human rights being converted from guiding principles to a treaty. I think these are preconditions to a better world to live in for ordinary people. Those people who were living there were living in slums, and they had no idea what happened to them. They were in no way responsible for what happened. And yet today, they're the ones who are till today affected because MIC was a substance which crossed the blood barrier, blood-brain barrier. It crossed that barrier. And because it crossed that barrier, it affected unborn children. And this was one of the biggest issues about the settlement, the fact that they did not put in a reopener clause. Because you have to understand the impact of the disaster on generations who are not yet born. You know also, Salil, that the groundwater is affected.
Yes, I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. Tell us about that, yes.
There's been no remediation of groundwater. And so obviously the people in the local area should not be drinking water from the groundwater source. And every time this issue is raised, we are told that, okay, we will supply you water in bottles. It's not the answer to the problem. The answer to the problem lies in what are you going to do about groundwater? The other issue which remains unaddressed 40 years later is the question of disposal of the plant itself.
Yes.
If any of you ever happen to go to Bhopal, you might want to visit.
It's like a ghostly skeleton. You can still see it there, and you know something terrible happened. There are the skull and crossbone signs outside, do not enter.
Yes, it's still there. The plant is still there. It has not been dismantled. It has not been incinerated. And I learned just before coming that some tenders have been floated for, and some money has been set aside for the disposal of the plant itself.
Right. I do have a couple more questions, but we have 9 more minutes, so I just wanted to know if there are questions in Surya. Yes, please. And if you can say who you are. I know you, but everyone knows.
So I am Surya Dev. I am the Special Rapporteur on Right to Development and also law professor. So very insightful. And as I mentioned, Bhopal is the region why I started doing research in the year 2000 on business and human rights. So I want to connect and pick one of the things you mentioned about the next generations, the unborn children and all that. And I want to connect it with the rights of the future generations. So only a couple of days back, a declaration has been adopted. This is the Declaration of Future Generations. So the expectation now is that we should look at the rights of the future generations as well, those who are not born yet. So perhaps that is something as part of this conversation, human rights due diligence we talk about all the time. But should companies, as part of human rights due diligence, start looking at the impact of their activities on the future generations? And Bhopal, in retrospect, I think, provides a concrete example that they should.
Well, your question answers itself, doesn't it? I mean, we have no right to consume the world as if there is going to be no generation after us. Do we have such a right? We don't. And it's not what you take from the earth, it's what you give back to the earth that really matters, isn't it? That's my way of looking at the world.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And, when we look at the way the climate debate is shaping is absolutely at the core of what you're saying. So, yeah, absolutely. Other question? Yes, please, yeah. I'll come to you after that.
Hello, I'm Vidhi. So you talked about one of the issues being the pollution of groundwater, which cannot be undone. So we also talked about that there's no remediation of this issue. So what, as per you, would be remediation when there's pollution of groundwater which cannot be undone and it affects future generations who aren't born yet?
Well, I mean, maybe it can be undone. I'm not a technician. I cannot really answer that question for you, but your own intelligence will tell you that groundwater is also renewable. Now, you have a lot of things in India, like water harvesting and things like that, which there is in Maharashtra a very interesting project, which is ongoing right now, where the effort is to renew water bodies which have gone dry. I mean, the earth does have this amazing way of rejuvenating itself if you just let it rejuvenate itself and just help it along. So I don't agree there is no solution. The point is that since the time the disaster occurred, no one ever paid attention to the issue of what would happen to the groundwater. I said, okay, you take a plastic bottle and give somebody water to drink, and that's it. Okay, that's the solution that people found, and that is what we need to focus attention on. I was very impressed when I was picking up my cup of coffee from there. They took an extra 200 baht from us and said, if you come and return this, we will give you. And I said, why? And then I realized that it was about patterns of consumption that we human beings have accepted without question. So I think the answer lies there. We need to look at the patterns of consumption which have been normalized, which have been rapacious as far as the earth is concerned.
Please, yeah.
I am Ram Charitra Shah from Center for Public Health and Environmental Development, CFED, in Nepal, which is also the partner organization for Asian Network for Right of Occupational and Environmental Victim, NROB. As a part of NROB, I have been assessing the accident happening in India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and then Pakistan. And what I learned and seen, at least in India, every week there is an accident of a small up to larger scale. And it is not only happening in different places. In some of the city, there is a multiple accident in the same city, even in the same plant. So my question is, what we have learned, what the government of India has learned from Bhopal gas tragedy, if after 40 years, again same kind of again and again accident is still ongoing, and related to, associated with that accident, all sort of a story you have told has been going to repeat again and again. Water contamination, air contamination, no settlement, no compensation, all are there. And what is happening at the moment in the ease of doing business, in the name of so-called development, even they lose or they even uplift the most requirement of like environmental impact assessment, OSH law has been weakened. So one hand we are doing weakening the control measure tools like EIA, OSH guideline. In other hand, we are also try to promote BHR. So it is like conflicting with each other. So how, my question is, what is learned from Bhopal gas tragedy so far, since it is repeating once again and again?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I just have to correct you when you use the word accident, okay? Because none of these are accidents, right? So let's be very precise with our language. Most of them are human-made disasters. So if you ask me what is the lesson to learn, it is the vigilance that is required to ensure enforceability of the systems we have put in place, which are meant to protect human beings. That's the lesson I have learned. It's the vigilance of civil society that has actually, I would say, is the real progress that I have seen, other than anything else. But they're not accidents. They're actually created by negligence. They're created by want of a strong regulatory framework, and that's where the answer lies.
Yeah. Time? Yeah, one last question, yeah, because I do have one final question to ask, and then we must stop.
Hello, it's me Madan Tungana from Nepal, a journalist. As a journalist, I just have some queries only. I just heard that there is no facility or they can't drink water in the Bhopal. So how are they obtaining drinking water if they can't use groundwater? Number one. Number two, have the victim been adequately compensated by the government or not? I just, maybe last year, 2-3 years ago, the Supreme Court given some verdict about that. But I'm not sure that it's still the time they are fighting for the more justice. Another one, I have heard that the soil and the plants are still contaminated. So what is being done about this? And how are they, if the water, soil and the plants are contaminated, so how are they managing irrigation in the Bhopal? And the last one is there still ongoing fight for the justice, you and the affected people? So as a journalist, I just have queries only.
Yeah, so the question is about water, what do people do to drink? 2, how are they able to grow food there? 3, what is happening with the continuing quest for justice? These are the broad.
You must remember we are meeting 40 years after the disaster occurred. So in any case, the official narrative was that these are slums and these are unauthorized habitations. So the 2 or 3 things have happened. A lot of people who were alive at that time are no longer in this world. As I said, their children are there. But there has been a shifting away from the precise location where the plant has been located. Efforts have been made to relocate them into different areas so that this one particular problem is taken care of. And during the temporary period, as I said, water was being supplied to them from sources other than groundwater. The continuing fight for justice, I think the battle for compensation is more or less over. It is not adequate, but the criminal cases are still going on.
I think there's one last question. Please keep it short. Okay, make it very short, just one and one, but I'll have to stop there.
Please, ma'am. Ma'am, I'm Gautam Bhardwaj. Even I'm a practicing lawyer from India. And in fact, I'm associated with the Legal Services Authority as well, as I just mentioned earlier. In fact, I just wanted to say one thing with regard to the legal services part, that till now, what I believe that legal services has not been made a party or maybe a part of this Bhopal case, what we have been dealing since past 40 years now. So what I believe, even if, what do you think about, like if the legal services can play a vital role or can be a part as a stakeholder, we can say, so that it can just be a bridge between the government or the departments as well as the judicial side also for their sustainable development and to keep the measures for the victims as well.
Let's take the second one as well so that we can combine them. Yeah, please. There's one more question at the back, yeah.
Hello, I'm Shikha Cha from Nepal. I have one question. You mentioned that there are post-generational health impacts women are facing, pregnancy issues and all this. So has the compensatory framework of India taken these health impacts, post-generational health impacts into account?
Yeah. So the first question is on the legal services and the role, and the second is whether the compensation mechanism of India has taken into account the future generations.
So on the legal aid, I cannot disagree with you, but what you have to understand is that 40 years ago, the legal aid system in India was not as vibrant as it is today, but it can still play a very important role, that you say, of being a bridge between the agencies and the victims, which they can still play, because till today, the health issue continues to be a major issue. On the question of it was the unborn children.
Yeah, the compensation for the unborn children. Yeah.
I do not think that the compensation for unborn children has been taken care of, but the provision of health services, because one of the remediation measures that the Supreme Court directed was the setting up of a dedicated hospital which is available only to victims of the Bhopal gas leak disaster, where they go, where their documentation has to be placed on record. So apart from remediation, it is equally important to document the after effects of exposure to MIC, and that role is being played by the health services rather than by the monetary services. They are being provided with health services.
And here's my final question. Give us something to hope. Is there a better scenario? Do you see, you keep going to Bhopal often, you meet the children there, you see life there. What gives you hope?
Look, 2 or 3 things. One, as I told you, when I asked my interns to work on it, and they said they didn't know about it, but when they read about it, they were full of fury, and that gave me hope. Okay, that it stirred their conscience. So I feel that if we can do something to stir the conscience of a younger generation, that is a very big achievement, and that gave me a lot of hope. It made me feel that, well, it was even worth it asking these interns to work on it. Ordinarily, I would have just worked on it myself and just got on with it. But the big advantage of getting 2 of them to work on this particular presentation was that I'm sure that they're going to go to Bhopal and work in Bhopal, both of them. So that gives a lot of hope. The other thing, of course, is, I would say, a meeting like this, because it's remembrance. And I think remembrance is an important part of remediation. Okay? If you had not had a session like this, at a meeting like this, there would be many people who wouldn't even know what happened in Bhopal 40 years ago. So that also gives me hope that the continuity between my memory, yours, and the memory of the people sitting over here matters a lot to me. And that's why I decided to accept this invitation when it was given to me. So I'm very hopeful.
So thank you, A. So first of all, thank you for coming. But more important, thank you for all that you do, you have done, and you will keep doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salil. It's been a pleasure.